You can't just keep repeating criminal conduct with very superficial and false narratives and expect people to believe you. I mean, the relentless Western criminality has undermined its claims as for democracy and respecting international law. And the media themselves have been shown over time to be something pathetic and complicit in this continual violence, continual criminality with their continuous kind of absurd cover stories. So this is why we argue that this history of 8 decades of non-stop violence, criminal intervention in foreign countries, and the media's servile enabling of this criminality has resulted in then the death of Western democracy. The idea that there is a democracy in the West has just been demolished.
Hi, and welcome to Global Majority for Peace podcast. I'm Ileana Chan. Every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement to promote peace and challenge the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. We will be posting the first part here on YouTube and the full episode on our Patreon for members to watch in full for free. So please sign up to be a patron. And if you would like to give us a donation, just know that it will sustain our work. And this is also a podcast, so you will find the audio tomorrow on every Wednesday on Patreon and also on Spotify and Amazon Music. This week, I have the pleasure to say that Finian Cunningham is our guest on Global Majority for Peace. He is a former editor and writer for major news media organizations, but former, so don't hold that against him. He has written extensively on international affairs with articles published in several languages. He is the author of the new book, Killing Democracy, Western Imperialism's Legacy of Regime Change and Media Manipulation. And I have read this book, and I have to say, everybody needs to be reading this book. It has so much information that we genuinely need. So please check this out. The links will be down below in the description. So Finian, welcome to Global Majority for Peace.
Ileana, thanks very much for having me on and doing such a lovely introduction and promoting the books so enthusiastically. Thanks very much.
Yeah, no, it's really good. And I feel like there's so much. I've been doing anti-imperialism work for a while now, for a few years now. And this book really helps still fill out so many facts and so many explanations for, covert operations and stuff like that. Like really the infrastructure of US empire that I think most of us just don't know because it's covert. And even though now it's readily it's available, right? And this is how you get this research documentation. I mean, most people are not going to have access to it. They're not going to realize how it all connects. So I really appreciate you putting this book together. It has also, I have to say, some other authors that are really amazing on here. And so, yeah, all the information will be down below. But anyway, we usually start every interview with a little bit more of a personal question on a personal note from our guests so that the audience can get to know them. And the question is basically, what was the origin of your politicization? Was there a particular incident that led you to your worldview?
Yeah, Ileana, good question. It's great to be introduced like that to your listeners, and thanks again for having me on. Well, I was born in Belfast in the early 1960s, 1963, and then there was the conflict in the north of Ireland, blew up in the late 60s and 70s and 80s and into the 90s, and that's when I grew up, going to school in Belfast, surrounded by lots of violence, and in that milieu, in that environment, inevitable that you start to observe how state power is wielded in illegal and criminal ways, and the use of violence, state violence, the use of dirty tricks operations, using death squads to implement to obtain your goals against perceived enemies, and the use of the Irish media, the British media, very much were utilized by the British state to promote its kind of version of what was going on and to denigrate other people. So it was great learning. It was a terrible way for any child to grow up in that surrounded by violence, but it was a great learning, great insights into how state power is abused and its various instruments. Like the military forces, the paramilitary forces, the media as a propaganda system. So that was formative for me. Now, I can't say I had it all clearly worked out, but I was certainly, like a lot of people in my generation growing up, were becoming cognizant of these kind of forces that, what the official claims of democracy and upholding the rule of law are very, kind of superficial and duplicitous. You do become kind of quite, in a good way, cynically skeptical of these kind of official claims. Then I would say another period that was very formative for me was when I went to work in England, in Cambridge, the city in south of England. I was working in a scientific publishing company. I graduated from university with a master's degree in agricultural chemistry, and I was working in the Royal Society of Chemistry as a scientific publishing. But while I was in Cambridge, not doing the day job, I would be going to various activist meetings. And there was a great community there in Cambridge of anti-war groups, peace groups, solidarity groups. You had the Cuban Solidarity Group, the Chile Solidarity Group, Nicaragua Solidarity Group, international anti-war, anti-imperialist, pro-peace groups. And that was very educational into the international level. But it also kind of like built on my own experience, my parochial experience growing up the north of Ireland and how that conflict was propagated. So it tied in, from a local level to the more global level, and then became aware of people like Karl Marx and Noam Chomsky, and started reading and becoming, I think, educated in international politics and issues like propaganda, the imperialism, the capitalist system, how it engenders war and rapacious interventions to access resources, and all these influences came together and led me then into journalism. I decided that I want to write about things like that, explore things more deeply, and to try to communicate to other people what I felt were important structural causes of violence and conflict in the world, and to try to explain not only to myself but to other people what are these forces. And it became, like I would say, like a vocation, a mission to do that. And that's why I quit my job in Cambridge in 1993, came back to Ireland and started to try to pursue a career as a journalist, from local newspapers up to national newspapers, and then worked in international newspapers. But I had to go back to the very beginning of the entry into journalism, learn that whole profession, journalese, the language of journalese, how to write, how to edit. It took me quite a while to develop the trade and to become, proficient in journalism. But the whole goal for me was to write about the issues that we are now talking about in your program.
I mean, I think one of the things that's kind of fascinating for me is that you obviously entered journalism with that goal, as you're saying, to sort of expose the power structures that current Western media is very much complicit with, not just complicit, a massive tool for imperialism currently. You talk about this in your book, and I just want to say that your latest book, Killing Democracy, Western Imperialism's Legacy of Regime Change and Media manipulation, is a very useful source that elucidates what the US as a country really is beneath this incredibly effective cover of US propaganda. And I think sometimes when I say US propaganda, people think that I'm only talking about the US, and I'm not. I mean, the thing with US propaganda and Western propaganda is it extends all over the world. I mean, the infrastructure, the funding, etc. I mean, it's all over the world. But as your title suggests, you focus in on covert regime change operations that you make the case are a core mechanism of imperialism. And this is something that the US alone has committed at least 100 documented cases. So before we get into the whole thing of what's happening in Venezuela, can you break down for us first and explain what that means? 100 covert regime change operations, and this is documented. So how does that work?
Mm-hmm. Well, Ileana, I'll have to reach out and pay tribute to my co-authors here in the book, Daniel Kovalek, Jeremy Kuzmarov, KJ New, whom you've had on recently in your program, and Ron Wiedener. So there's 5 authors, fantastic people, workers, writers in their own fields. I mean, I've got to know them over the years and have the highest respect for all of them. And that's why I invited them to join me on this book, because it's quite a compendious book. I mean, we're dealing with a lot of history, a lot of countries, this policy of regime change and media manipulation, quite a big subject. So I invited the other 4 guys to join me to try to get the book out in short order. I mean, if I was to try to do the book on my own, it could have taken another year. And in this very dangerous, dynamic world that we're living in, I felt that's too long. We need to get a book out in shorter order than that. And that's why the other authors I invited to join me, and they all beautifully stepped up to the plate very enthusiastically and diligently and delivered their case studies as chapters in the book. So I just want to pay respect to those authors. Ileana, we were looking at the whole concept of the book, regime change. If we start to look at where did this begin? Where did this policy begin? What were the circumstances? And I think you can break down the last, say, 100 years into two phases. There was the imperialist period, the late 18th century, 19th century, the 20th century, early 20th century, where countries, the Western powers, the European powers, and the United States just quite openly, blatantly went into countries to destroy or to install puppet regimes to do their bidding. I mean, the United States in particular, 1900s, when President William McKinley was in power, then Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, they just openly called themselves imperialists. I mean, there was no embarrassment about this, declaring yourself an imperialist. We'll have to get on to Trump because he really has taken it almost kind of back to those years. But then when the imperialist rivalry resulted in 2 horrific world wars, the First World War, the Second World War, and there was, especially after the Second World War, with the death toll and destruction on a global level that was unprecedented in human history. I mean, we're talking about at least 70 million people, probably 100 million people were destroyed in a 5-year war. And after that war, I mean, I think the world was shaken to its core, the horror, the destruction. Also, the public, the people around the world were disgusted and contemptuous of imperialist misconduct, imperialist criminality, might is right sort of attitude. There was then a global consensus for some sort of like international order. The UN Charter then came in to be established after the Second World War, and the whole purpose was to try to formulate a system of international law which would prohibit any repeat of the imperialist rivalry and violence that then erupts into these abominable world wars. So after the Second World War and the establishment of the UN and the UN Charter, there was supposed to be a new order of peace where nations were seen to be equal, not a situation where there was powerful elite minority that could just lord it over other countries. The whole history of colonialism and imperialism was in disrepute, and there was supposed to be this new beginning after the Second World War with the UN Charter. And the UN Charter, I think, is a very noble institution of defining nations as all equal. The sovereignty of nations would be inviolable. It was paramount that we had to recognize countries cannot just unilaterally intervene in other countries for their resources, for whatever political reason, economic reasons that they want. So we supposedly had a new beginning after the Second World War with the UN Charter. Now, the thing is, Ileana, the Western powers had then created themselves a terrible conundrum, because imperialism, by its definition, is driven by controlling other people's resources, stealing other people's resources, asserting yourself over other nations. I mean, this is the colonial powers were so accustomed to their privileges, they couldn't give that up. I mean, by an inherent part of their whole capitalist, imperialist economies, they couldn't just give up the propensities of imperialist use of imperialist power, although they had co-created the UN Charter. So they'd created themselves a really fundamental dilemma of not being able to assert their power in the overt way that they had been used to with the European colonial powers and the American imperialist conduct of Teddy Roosevelt and US administration before the Second World War. I mean, the US administration, with the banana wars and various other interventions in the Central American, Caribbean and Latin America, were just running it like their backyard. So all that history was in disrepute, and the UN Charter was supposed to be this new beginning. So to kind of overcome this dilemma, this is where the whole policy of regime change came into operation. Covert imperialism, stealth imperialism, where you could, okay, on one hand, uphold the sanctity of the UN Charter and the principles of respecting sovereign nations, but on the other hand, covertly, you could just continue as an imperialist power without the public shame or the public accountability of that kind of criminality. So this is where regime change, covert operations were born, because of the public declaration of supporting the UN Charter and the establishment of it. Behind its back, the Western powers had to find some way of continuing their imperialist business as before, but only in secret. So that's where I would define where the whole regime change policy was born, how it came into being.
That's really interesting, because even now after 100 documented cases, now that we've seen the US just very, very recently invade Venezuela and kidnap the head of state, President Maduro, and the first lady, people are still saying things like, oh my gosh, now this means the end of the international law, as if not for this particular, incredibly blatant act of imperialism and stated intention, Trump even stated intention to impose a colonial style occupation. If not for this instance, international law was completely abided by the US. That's the implication behind a lot of this sentiment, which they're rightly condemning it, but they're still upholding the propaganda that allows the US to get away with this, and has gone away with this for like over 100 years or more, as you're rightly pointing out. So do you think, like you just touched a little bit upon this idea of Trump being kind of an interesting figure, because he's pretty much in some ways taking off the mask of this veneer of civility, this veneer of moral authority. In some ways he's taking off the mask. But the thing is, he's so chaotic that he still is justifying his actions even while taking off the masks. I mean, it's not just Venezuela either. I mean, it's just this past week, we've had the invasion of Venezuela, the kidnapping of Maduro, but we've also had, prior to that, bombing in Nigeria and also an attempted U.S. assassination of Ibrahim Traore. So there's a lot of different things happening right now. In your opinion, what is happening? Is this an escalation? Is this a departure from previous patterns? How do you make sense of this?
Well, I mean, that's what we tried to get across in the book, Ileana. Decades of this criminality, done covertly, and with the cover of various pretexts, like it was the Cold War, or it was eradicating weapons of mass destruction, or pro-democracy, or protecting human rights. And the Western media always indulge these, fantasies and these kind of like really absurd cover stories to enable these interventions and regime change operations or outright wars. So the media have always indulged this kind of propaganda to enable it. But when you've done this for 8 decades, and it's been just going on for 8 decades now, a lot of your listeners will be well aware of this criminal conduct. So I have to acknowledge that people are aware of it. A lot of the Western public aren't aware of this kind of history. They took the propaganda on face value. So the Americans went into war in Vietnam to stop the communist infiltration of Southeast Asia. And a lot of people bought into that. But I think the repetition, the relentless repetition of these illegal interventions and the media propaganda that goes with it, I think has had a chronic corrosive effect on people's respect for the Western governments, their credibility, and their own authority has been corroded. You can't just keep repeating criminal conduct with very superficial and false narratives and expect people to believe you. I mean, the relentless Western criminality has undermined its claims as for democracy and respecting international law. And the media themselves have been shown over time to be something pathetic and complicit in this continual violence, continual criminality with their continuous kind of absurd cover stories. So this is why we argue that this history of 8 decades of non-stop violence, criminal intervention in foreign countries, and the media's servile enabling of this criminality has resulted in then the death of Western democracy. The idea that there is a democracy in the West has just been demolished. And I think Trump now has got to the point where it doesn't even have to be kind of like given a cover story. He's just sitting quite blatantly going back to the early 1900s era where it's just an imperialist intervention and is quite upfront. I mean, okay, there was an attempt for the last 4 or 5 months to mischaracterize the Maduro government, the Maduro presidency, as a narco-terrorist regime. That was peddled for a while. But now Trump is now just saying, we're going to get the oil. We just want the oil. We're in the oil business. And other countries better watch out because they're next, like Cuba, Colombia, and others. As you said there, Ileana, for the last year of Trump's presidency, he's bombed 7 different countries. So we have got to this quite frightening situation now where there's no longer even any kind of pretense of some sort of ulterior benign agenda of promoting democracy. It's just out and out imperialism. And this is where I think it ties in with the book's concept that they've killed democracy. They've just done away with democracy. It's now going on to back to the phase of open imperialist violence.
I mean, I would say the one thing that I'm seeing in terms of the propaganda is, in order, I think, an attempt to hold on to this moral authority is to sort of suggest that Trump and Netanyahu, which obviously, again, like this idea of Israel being a separate entity from US empire, I think is very complicated. You could say that Israel has outsized power. You can say it has outsized lobbyist money, all these things. But ultimately, this attempt to completely separate Trump and Israel from the wider Western imperialist project, which has been ongoing, like you said, really for hundreds of years. The way that they're doing it, I think, is also a way to maintain moral authority. We're not as bad as Trump. We're not as bad as Israel. They don't even really acknowledge how many genocides that the US empire has actually committed, right? So it's like the genocide in Palestine is completely new. It is shocking, but it's not shocking because of its uniqueness. It's shocking because actually people can see it. I think that's the thing that's shocking about it. Not so much that it is completely unprecedented. Would you agree with that? Yeah. So the other thing, though, that I think is interesting here is, again, this sort of like false equivocation, because we do have China and Russia. Granted, Russia with the military operation in Ukraine, you could say, yes, there have been international law transgressions, but I mean, they pale in comparison to what the US has done, certainly. But I think China as a country has been very, very careful to adhere to international law. They mention the UN Charter in almost every single foreign ministry official statement. They're just very clear to emphasize international law, the UN Charter, sovereignty, and multilateralism in almost every official statement that they have. And yet, we are in this place again where it is always China and Russia that are transgressing on international law, and it is still again the US that is, and the West that is upholding international law. It is so frustrating. But can you sort of expand on this idea of the UN Charter? Because now I'm hearing these things like, especially with what's happening in Venezuela, this idea of like, well, what's even the point of having it? Let's just throw it out, you know? I mean, what is even the point? What are your thoughts on this? Can you sort of expand on this? And if there's a pathway forward, there's certainly a pathway forward talked about by China, but is this in any way feasible in the world that we live in?
Ileana, I do think the UN Charter is certainly something that has to be adhered to. It's a model for international relations. I mean, let's just begin with the basic principles of the equality of nations and respect for national sovereignty, the borders of countries, and non-interference and non-aggression. I mean, these are very important principles that need to be abided by, recognized, and supposedly all recognized by the founders of the UN. But why is it not abided by? Why is it being continually violated? I mean, we have to look at the record. Which nation has violated the UN Charter? It's the United States and its Western allies. Let's look at like the real reasons for why we've got this kind of continual, relentless, incorrigible violation of the UN Charter. There's something about the Western powers, their economies, the Western capitalist system, how it operates, how it exploits other countries, exploits other countries' resources, the imperative need to get control of those resources. I mean, there's Trump, giving Exhibit A demonstration with Venezuela. It's all about the oil. I think the UN Charter is a document that has to be adhered to. It's the question of like, why is it not being adhered to? Which countries are so relentlessly violating it? And then look at what's underlying their motives. With regard to China, I mean, yes, China and Russia have yesterday have at the UN Security Council quite vehemently condemned what's going on with the United States towards Venezuela. And both countries, among others, have been pointing out that, look, this is why the UN Charter must be abided by. If we don't do that, then there will be international chaos and descent into barbarism. Some people might say, well, that's rich of Russia to talk about this when you look at Ukraine, but you'd have to understand why the Ukraine conflict has come about. I mean, it's because of decades of NATO's aggression and expansion towards Russia and the CIA-sponsored coup in Kiev in 2014, creating a very neo-fascist regime in Ukraine that aggressed the Russian people of the eastern Ukraine. Ukraine was being deployed as a proxy to destabilize Russia and committed atrocities against Russian people. Russia had legal right to do what it did, which was to go in and stop this slaughter of ethnic Russian people, and to, not as it's trying to do, to create some sort of security arrangement with NATO. I mean, what country has China invaded ever in the last? Well, okay, there was the 1979 brief war with Vietnam, but over the last decades, nobody can point to China as subverting other countries, transgressing the UN Charter on the level that the United States has done with its Western allies. I mean, you mentioned earlier on, Ileana, at least 100 covert operations, and we're not talking about the other outright wars like Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan, and just in the last year, bombing 7 countries. Trump has done. You mentioned them earlier on. So, the United States misconduct is out on its own, along with its Western accomplices, especially Britain, its so-called special relationship with Britain, to enable this imperialist conduct. So, you cannot at all compare the United States and its criminality, its imperialist criminality, with Russia or China. I mean, and as I said yesterday, it was Russia and China who have been condemning the United States' aggression towards Venezuela vehemently and calling upon the United States to abide by the UN Charter. Now, I think the kind of a hilarious thing, Ileana, is that if you look at the Western media, like the New York Times and the Guardian and the BBC and various people like that, they have been trying to distract from what is US aggression, US war crimes against Venezuela. They've been trying to distract from that by saying, oh, now Trump is in the same category as Russia's Putin and China's Xi Jinping, that he is now giving these other so-called alleged tyrants a free hand to do whatever they want to do with Ukraine and with Taiwan. I mean, it's a complete distortion, kind of sneaky way of apologizing or minimizing what the US is doing by falsely conflating it with some other ridiculous association with Russia and China. This is a good example of how the Western media operate. Instead of just condemning the United States government, Trump's regime, for aggression and war crimes, kidnapping a head of state, killing Venezuelans in their illegal invasion of that country to kidnap the president, instead of just condemning that and pointing out that this is an out and out absolute violation of the UN Charter, the Western media have tried to minimize that by then immediately going on to make some sort of like false association with Russia and China. And it's just the Western media's function as a propaganda service.
Thank you for watching the first part of our interview. Please head over to patreon.com/Empire Watch to watch the full episode. The podcast is also available as an audio on Spotify and Amazon Music every Saturday.